Hi, I'm Rick Barron. In today's RAF 5 History of Neurology lecture, I want to talk about Charles Bell and Francois Magendie, and I subtitled this British versus French Fights in the Age of Napoleon and a New Law is Discovered. So who was Charles Bell, who was eventually knighted as Sir Charles Bell? He was born in Edinburgh. He went to med school in Edinburgh, and his mentor, one of his mentors, was Alexander Monroe, of the Freeman of Monroe. He was also a very talented artist, and everyone in his family had artistic talent as well. And while he was in med school, he published a book on systems of dissection, and it became very popular. But he left Edinburgh in the late 1700s and early 1800s for London. He was part of a diaspora of Scottish physicians and anatomists who were very talented, but many of them relocated in London. And his career was in London. He was a soldier. He was a physician in the British and French War, and he took care of wounded soldiers. And he was actually present at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So we know Charles Bell from his many publications. He first wrote on nervous anatomy in his brother John Bell's book on anatomy of the human body. He was also a physician and author. When he moved to London, he had been working on a manuscript and it was published right after he got to London on essays on the anatomy of expression in painting. He actually wrote this book for artists, so artists could understand the physiology of facial expressions. And so his books became very well known in the art community, and he actually had access then to the social and artistic community in London, which he enjoyed. He then wrote a neuroanatomy book called The Idea of New Anatomy of the Brain, but he really wrote it for his friends, and there were only about 100 copies that were made. And actually that is the book here, and he did all of his own drawings. They're just beautiful drawings, and he has a human head with the brain exposed and sort of leaning on the hand. And then he published numerous papers in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and in 1830 he wrote a much larger book on nervous system of the human body, where he had, again, a number of beautiful drawings like this picture of the seventh cranial nerve. So these books made him extremely famous, and he had a very busy practice as well. Here are some peripheral nerves where he has a picture of the brachial plexus, and then also this beautiful diagram of all of the spinal roots and cranial nerves coming off the brainstem and spinal cord. These are some pictures from his Anatomy of Expression, which again he wrote for artists. And he not only drew human expression, but he also drew expression of animals in this book as well. His contributions were many scientifically. He demonstrated that cranial nerve 5 was sensory to the face and motor to mastication. He demonstrated that cranial nerve 7 was motor to the muscles of expression, and he described facial palsy due to cranial nerve 7 damage from a variety of causes. He described cranial nerve 7 damage due to gunshot wounds, syphilis, goring by an ox, and also where no cause could be found, and we now call this Bell's palsy. He described the long thoracic nerve, which we say was one of his discoveries, long thoracic nerve of Bell. He described Bell's phenomena, whereby when you close the eyes voluntarily, your eyeballs rotate up. And, of course, the Bell-Magendie law. So before we get to what the law was, who was Francois Magendie? He really can be considered the founder of a French experimental medicine, predating Claude Bernard. He was born in Bordeaux, but he moved to Paris because his father was very active in the French Revolution. He went to med school in Paris, and his mentors were Dupuytren and Bichat. And he practiced as a hospital physician his entire life. But in addition to practicing medicine, he was a lecturer in anatomy. He set up his own anatomy school. And he began doing experimental physiology. And he published a book in 1816 that became very well known, describing a variety of different experiments done in animals. Beginning in 1822, he focused on research on the nervous system, and he ultimately was given an academic rank of professor. He did some central nervous system experiments, such as dividing different parts of the cerebellar connections and seeing what it resulted in animals, removing one or both cerebral hemispheres. And of course, he described the apertura medialis ventriculi quarti, which we know now as the foramen of Magendie. Regarding the Bell-Magendie law, who was first and what was it? So in 1822, Magendie published a paper in the journal cited here, a French publication, in which he divided anterior and posterior spinal roots in dogs. He would stimulate the posterior root and he elicited pain. He would stimulate the anterior root and he elicited movement. And so he basically proved that the spinal nerves had two divisions, and he also showed that sensory information entered the spinal cord via the posterior roots and motor information exited the spinal cord via the anterior roots. This is the Bell-Magendie law. This paper came out, and Bell said, well, I had already said that. I said it in my 1811 book that he had written for his 100 friends. And in the 1811 book, this comes right out of that book, where he said, I found that I could cut across the posterior fascicles of nerves, which took its origin from the posterior portion of the spinal marrow without convulsing the muscles of the back. But then on touching the anterior fascicles with the point of the knife, the muscles of the back were immediately convulsed. So he thought he had described it first. Clearly not in as much detail as Magendie did, and so the battle waged for years. They also argued over other neuroanatomical issues as well. So while Napoleon was battling Nelson and the British in war, Dr. Bell and Dr. Magendie were having their scientific battles in the press, and they both are considered pillars of the beginning of experimental neurophysiology and of clinical neurology. I hope you've enjoyed this brief ARIA 5 segment on Dr. Bell and Dr. Magendie. Thank you.